Yeah, absolutely.
Hi, everyone. This is Craig Zelzer from PCDN Global here for another edition of the Social Change Career Podcast. Today, in Season 12, Episode 6, we're going to be talking about navigating peace, a career in conflict resolution, and beyond with Dr. Zachary Metz. For people who have not joined us before, the podcast generally goes for about an hour. We really enjoy hearing from people. If you're watching live on LinkedIn or YouTube, particularly on LinkedIn, in the comments section, feel free to share a few sentences or bullet points about yourself, where you're watching from, and particularly your questions and comments. This will be up as a podcast episode in about 2 weeks, and it's one of almost 150 episodes with brilliant innovators from all over the world, from impact investors, engineering for change, reducing gender-based violence, or almost anything you can imagine. 3 quick requests. Please follow Dr. Metz on LinkedIn and check out Consensus. Please check out PCDN. And if you like the podcast, or even if you don't, consider rating and sharing it to help grow our impact. And I will share Zach's bio. He's a partner in the firm Consensus, and he's the Director of Peacebuilding, and also works on talent development practices. In addition to his extensive work within the private sector, he consults to national and local governments, political leaders, United Nations agencies, and with international civil society leaders. He also teaches graduate level courses at Columbia University School of International Public Affairs, SIPA, and at NYU. He is actually, I think, in the 24th year of teaching a very innovative class, which we'll talk about.
Yes.
Prior to joining Consensus, he was Director of Education and Training for Columbia University's Center for International Conflict Resolution, where he worked on educational elements of their international and domestic programs and projects. He started off with a focus on domestic conflict resolution, working as a mediator, trainer, and program director with the Northwest Institute for Restorative Justice and Dispute Resolution Center. He has a master's from SIPA at Columbia University and a PhD from the New School, participating from Medellin, Colombia. And Zach, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule and letting us hear from your wisdom and experience. And if you want to start, just say where you're streaming in from, and then a little bit, how in the world did you even come up with the idea? I think I'm probably a little bit older than you, but where in the world did you even first hear about conflict resolution? And when you were younger, did you know that's what you wanted to do, or you had other, aspirations?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm just so pleased and thankful for this conversation with you and all the work that you've been doing to really create this community of thinking and learning over decades. So I'm in a slightly less, I think, idyllic place. I'm in northern New Jersey. Columbia, I think, a little bit warmer and a little bit more dynamic, but this is where I am. Typically, I'm in New York City when I'm working, and when I'm not, I'm here in northern part of New Jersey. And yeah, it's a great question, and it's also true that when we were entering this field, I think the idea of becoming a professional in this space was a bit kind of novel. At least that was my experience. And for me, the entry was really two experiences that were pivotal for me, kind of peak moments that were several months long each. And maybe I could reflect on that a little bit in terms of the impetus or the catalyst for me. Both were in a university study program, 2 separate programs through Earlham College, where I was an undergraduate student long ago. And the first was a really innovative program that essentially brought students from the Midwest to Northern Ireland. And this was in the early 1990s, when what's often referred to as the Troubles was very much still relevant and present in the streets and lives of Northern Irish society. And this is quite a radical idea that that the schools could take young people and bring them directly into a conflict impacted society, not to do much, but to really live and experience and understand what makes societies conflict in this way. And I think even more importantly for me, what is happening at the level of response from within a society, whether it's political, cultural, within civil society, faith-based, all of that was happening in this very vibrant way alongside or in response to this quite intense level of discord and violence and polarization. So just literally living in that environment really shaped me fundamentally in terms of how I think about the world of societies in conflict. And I think most importantly, the profound sense of respect and just awe that we had for action being undertaken by sometimes political actors, but also everyday community groups and civil society groups and those who were driven by faith and young people and women. And it was really shaping kind of how I thought about conflict and society overall. So that was catalytic. This was actually under the leadership of one of the real founders of the field of peace studies, adjacent to our field of peace building, a guy named Tony Bing, who's no longer with us, but who really had a vision for helping very young people who were in that case we were studying political science, think in a different way about conflict. So that catalyzed something deep in me. The next experience was actually essentially the same program, but in Jerusalem. And again, this is 1992, 93, living in the old city, living with communities that were addressing and experiencing ongoing endemic violence and wrestling with action, wrestling with political engagement at all levels, whether it be education or development or activism around gender and youth. So these two experiences for me were catalytic, and there wasn't really a field for me to enter professionally. It wasn't like, now become a peace builder. In fact, as you know, Craig, that language hadn't even really permeated the discourse of the field, even though at some level Galtung had sort of made reference to it in the mid-1970s, and then Jean-Paul Lederach was using some of this language, but I didn't have a sense of it, let's put it that way. And so it kind of gave me this sense of engagement, but then where do I go next was really the question after I left college and was trying to think about, well, what does this all mean to me as a global citizen, but even more as trying to get a job and do something that somehow lights the same fire for me and addresses some of the same dilemmas that I saw communities addressing. But I think, Craig, for me, what still all these years later resonates is I wasn't studying these things in the abstract. And I also wasn't studying them as if I had the answers. It was the opposite. It was in the concrete, the mundane, the everyday, the lived. And it was very clear that none of us had answers, but the communities in which we were engaging or with whom we were in dialogue had a lot of answers. They also had a lot of questions. And so, none of them were naive, let's put it that way. And this is the other thing that really stays with me is I think so often people see those of us who are in this field, particularly, let's say, local communities, as being somehow out of touch with reality. Oh, they're so naive, or that's not how the world works, or whatever kind of bias one might have about hope. My experience is that it's literally the opposite. That the communities and the actors who are at the front lines of building peace are the least naive I've ever met. They are absolutely clear-eyed as to what's at stake, and what's at stake for them individually and personally and politically and economically. They are not naive. And I think this is a paradigm shift that we need to make around the reality that people who are in this experience will help us understand better, ultimately, if we're trying to be in support of those communities. So that's the beginning for me.
Yeah, so I won't go much into my story, but probably a few years older, but I had very similar experiences moving to Hungary right after another Cold War and spending a lot of time in Yugoslavia as it imploded, and just the insanity of that. And anyway, I won't go into all the details, but kind of educational exchanges changed my life, and I'm a huge believer in that. So just one comment for people who don't know, Earlham is, I think, Quaker college.
Yes, it has. I myself am
Quaker.
Not from that community as such, but had a lot of really rich experiences in and amongst the Quaker or Friends world. And yes, in fact, it is a historically and even contemporary has an orientation around a certain form of Quaker education.
Yeah. And I think Manchester and Goshen, isn't it called like so it's like historic peace churches and historic peace universities. So it's like peace studies has been around a long time there. Right. And just for anyone looking for a job, American Friends Service Committee, Quaker UN, United Nations office, like they all sometimes have fellowships and jobs. So, so how in the world did you get from, and we already have questions come in, so I'll ask just 2 more and then we'll start getting to them. And please let us know where you're watching from. But how in the world did you get from that, finishing a degree in political science, or if that was your field, and doing these exchanges? You graduated, and then like, how did you figure out like what was next? Like, did you work for a nonprofit? Did you just get trained as a mediator? Like, how did you, for people, our average listener tends to be more 32, but for people who are younger, who might go to college, be like, how do I start off? Like, how did you get to your first?
Yeah, and Craig, that's a great question. And one of your, when we were looking at, what to talk about, one of the questions I think comes up is like, how much is planned versus how much is serendipitous in our paths as we're pursuing a professional next step. So what happened was I moved to Seattle and I opened the Yellow Pages, which was a thing back then, right? A list of, organizations, companies, whatever. And I turned to mediation. Well, first I found meditation, and I thought, well, that's close, but that's not quite right. Also a good thing, I guess, but not what I was up to. And I just started calling places that did mediation because I saw that as connected to my passion. And I landed on a local dispute resolution center, countywide, and fairly robust and significant. And that was the beginning for me of becoming a trained mediator and mediator trainer. And what's interesting about that, so I joined this team. What's interesting about that, for me anyway, is that I entered the field in this sense from the perspective of people in conflict that we're trying to support, like very visceral, very granular, people who were fighting over whatever they were fighting over and trying to provide some sort of mediated process. So you're literally sitting at a table with people in conflict, and you're experiencing this really just deeply human dynamic, and you're trying to do something about it. And sometimes it helps and sometimes it doesn't, but it gave me this front row seat on human conflict. Obviously not violent, not intractable, not social or political, but still, you have this feeling of what it means to be with people as they wrestle with deep, deep, painful conflict. And I did that for many years. And it really, again, shaped me in terms of how I think. I think in terms of what can we actually do? And those years were really formative. I also had an opportunity to run a mediation program inside a maximum security prison. Thanks to another colleague there, my friend Chris Sheasley, who was, I think, just really an early adopter of mediation in unusual places. And we were given this incredible opportunity to bring mediation into a maximum security prison. And I think how that shaped me was this sense of when things are really high stakes, still we can bring approaches, not all is lost. And that was also, quite important for me in terms of building my professional identity. I also worked in a restorative justice center, so working with victims and offenders, and sometimes of quite violent crimes, and just thinking through like what are the limits of these approaches and how can we use them to really serve and support people in deep, deep distress and trauma and conflict. Then I decided to go back to school, graduate school, and I did what I think most people do, which is trying to figure out what am I supposed to study. And again, in the days when I think were in this phase of pursuing advanced degrees, it wasn't actually clear to me what I was supposed to study. It took me years to figure it out. So I looked at law school. That wasn't right for me because I didn't want to practice law. It just didn't feel like a good fit. But ultimately landed on international affairs as really the right route. And I still believe that political science and international affairs and related fields are really a powerful route into our field of peace building and international conflict. They're not the only route by any means, social work, education, even neuroscience, history, sociology, architecture. All of these can be really powerful routes. But for me, this was the right route. I wanted to understand the international system as clearly as I could, both its beauties and its problems, its dilemmas. And that's exactly what I feel I ultimately learned. And I'd like to tell you a quick story about that, because it gets at serendipity versus plan. So I did plan, and I went out and met with important professors at that time at various universities. One was American University. I met with Abdulaziz Saeed, who's again since passed away, but he welcomed me very much. And that was a beautiful conversation that I'll never forget, where he was essentially sharing his view on peace building from a specific vantage point that he came from, and others around the East Coast. I landed on a professor at Columbia who had just arrived, a guy named Andrea Bartoli, who you and I know well. And this is 1997 or so. And I sat with Andrea, and he said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "Well, I want to mediate international conflict. I want to resolve deadly, violent, traumatic social political conflict. I want to use my skills to resolve all of these deeply divided societies. And that's what I want to do." He said, "Very good. That's not a job. That doesn't exist. That's not going to happen." I said, "Oh, well, that's unfortunate." And I've thought about that conversation for now a couple of decades. He said, that's like, that's not happening." I said, "Okay, well, nice to meet you." He said, "No, you should come here. You should study here. You should be with me. And I'm building this center, and all kinds of interesting things are going to happen." And I said, "Okay, here's this guy who's telling me there's not the career that I want, but I should come and invest a lot of money, time, energy, mind space into something that he's saying kind of doesn't exist." But I said, "Okay, let's do it." And so that infectious sense of serendipity really took hold, and that possibility that he was kind of sharing with me. And I never regretted that. That, I think, was such a catalytic decision. I love that he was honest. And I think what he meant was much more nuanced and subtle than what I was taking in that moment. We could talk about that as well. But that was the on-ramp to international engagement. And I started in 1999 and finished 2001, started teaching September 2001, just after September 11th, and helped to build this, in addition to teaching, helped to build the Center for International Conflict Resolution at Columbia, at CIPA. And through that, had incredible experiences in Iraq, in Myanmar, in East Timor, in the Balkans, in Rwanda, and on the globe, all based on I think the foundational norms that matter to me in this field. First and foremost, relationships with local stakeholders and actors. And so that was really the beginning, or that next phase was that experience and everything that flowed from it.
Wonderful. So incredible. And Andrea has such a great sense of humor and was the director at what is ICAR, which is now the Carter School. Obviously, he's gone back more to practice.
Mm-hmm.
I'll ask one more question, and lots of questions are coming in. And please keep letting us know what you're watching. So just one question. I'm trained in mediation, never got certified, but done the training.
Yeah.
And so actually two questions there. So one is maybe about 6 years ago, I finally, for years, when people would say they want to get trained in mediation, I'd be like, it's such a great skill set. Like, it's invaluable.
Yes.
But a lot of people lived in this fantasy. They're going to get trained in mediator and then get a job in mediation. And I used to say the supply side of like the number of people who want to mediate is like this, the demand side of paid. And then finally, about 6 years ago, a professor from Nova was doing a book and asked me to do a chapter. And I finally found the data on like the number of trained mediators versus supply versus demand.
Oh, interesting.
So and so mediation, great facilitation, those are all incredible skill sets. They don't lead to jobs. They can be foundational blocks. So one is your advice for people who might want to work around mediation, like how to think about it broader. And then the second thing is more philosophical. Mm-hmm. So I've been in lots of situations where I've been a mediator.
Yeah.
And the fundamental challenge, I think, of so much of what we're talking about is human and community interaction. And it's usually there's two mutually incompatible truths that just like they just cannot coexist. Either A is true or B is true.
Yeah.
And as a person or the team or the group trying, this could be a dialogue process, but the person trying to help, I mean, lots of people are trying to help, but let's say someone helping to some degree, how do you go about holding these multiple truths in your brain and obviously empathizing? Because I won't go into a lot of specifics, but there was one time I was involved in a contract dispute. It wasn't me.
Okay.
And I was actually at the signing of a contract, and one party said it happened, one said it didn't. And just like, so like when there's like, how do you deal with that as a person? And like, is that an innate skill set or it's actually something you develop?
That's a great question. So maybe I'll take them in the order that you asked. And one is a bit more sort of nuts and bolts. And then this gives me time to think a bit more about your philosophical question, which is so elegant and beautiful. So I think the good news is both on the international side and on the, let's call it domestic or a kind of more interpersonal side, these fields have evolved and matured massively in the last 30 years. And that evolution means that people who want to get involved and do this work have a lot more opportunities. First of all, as you know, because you were really at the front lines of this, advanced degrees have come out on the scene as like a norm at this point. We can now do master's degrees in conflict. We can do PhDs in interdisciplinary PhDs in conflict and in peace and in mediation. And I mean, that landscape is new. It's the last 15 years, 20 years. And I think that that's important, that now the sort of understanding and discourse around this has expanded richly. And the second thing is, it's now, I think, well recognized that mediation or alternative dispute resolution or other kinds of conflict engagements are a net benefit for organizations, for companies, for groups, for institutions. And so at this point, it's hard to find a big organization or company that doesn't have some form of third-party support, whether it's an ombuds. It could be a vast, like at the United Nations, the ombuds function is massive. It could be an in-house mediator. It could be other kinds of dispute resolution mechanisms. The point that I'm trying to make is that we don't need to set up a shop. One doesn't need to set up a shop that says Metz Mediation Inc. to do this work. A lot of functions within, for example, human resources or other in-house structures, institutional structures, are really kind of have come really to understand that these services are not just nice to have. They really change the game in terms of conflict and its drag on everything, creativity, efficiency, sustainability, morale. So I think the good news is for anyone who wants to get into this field, there are many, many more roads, both on the domestic side and on the international side. But don't look, I would say, for Metz Mediation Inc. Look for a company or organization that has some progressive views on conflict. Absolutely, this point around ACR, Mediators Beyond Borders, these are great resources. And there are affinity groups, there's trainings, there's all kinds of ways to really bring yourself into that space. So I guess be creative, but know that those spaces really are there and they need your skills, they need your expertise, and just about a little bit of creativity to find the right entry point. And that's also true on the international side. So we're kind of mixing these two fields as if they're one and the same, and they really are distinct at some level. It just so happens that both you and I have navigated both over the decades, but I think they exist in somehow distinct spaces, even though conceptually we're sharing a lot of the same ideas that come from social psychology and political science and psychology and other disciplines. On the question, so hopefully that answers a little bit the question there. On the question of holding two truths and something happened, no, it didn't. Is it raining? Yes or no? These are empirical questions. These are facts. And then you're asked, so the first question is, how do we do that? And the second is it innate or is it somehow evoked? Do we develop it? I don't think it's innate. Maybe some folks come to this work with a kind of a more of an openness to thinking in that slightly radical way that two truths or more can coexist. I don't know. I certainly didn't come into the field with that as an innate way of looking at things. I had to learn it. And often it was learning it through engaging with communities in conflict, peace-building actors who could help me understand how they navigate these things. And then it's going to sound maybe a little bit esoteric, but as well, poetry and other forms of thinking about the world that help us radicalize a little bit this very binary, polarized, fixed view of reality, which just doesn't track to human experience. So engaging with poets, engaging with more radical and critical thinkers, feminist thinkers, those who help us understand the landscape as much more complex than it often gets portrayed. And in terms of holding it in one's mind as a practitioner, I think it gets easier. I think the core of it is accepting that the communities or the individuals or the societies that we're working with fundamentally believe what they believe. That's what they believe. They believe it's not raining. Why? That's for us to investigate and help them articulate if they need that support. But I think it's that, and you use the word that I would use, which is empathy, in the deepest sense of what it means to really say this, we are this community, and this community has suffered these harms, and therefore that is the enemy. I mean, that kind of thing has to be taken seriously. And so I think those are that's like just my quick reaction to this question of holding two truths and helping others navigate that. I think that is, Craig, a really, like, maybe the fundamental competency, and it goes well beyond any tool or strategy or intervention or program or project or whatever, because it lives in the body of the practitioner, and we bring it into the engagement in an embodied way with our counterparts, whether it's a divorce mediation or two societies struggling over their own future, armed and violent and traumatized and full of historical memories that drive today's violence. So yeah, those are my thoughts. And I just want to shout out once again poetry.
Wonderful. So 2 quick comments, and we'll bring in questions. So one, I had Galtung as a professor and was part of his network, and he's crazy.
Yes. I mean, you could say that, I think, in a good way.
But in a brilliant way.
Yes.
But, he's a mathematician by training, but he used to always talk about the 3 core things: empathy, creativity, actually 4 things: empathy, creativity, nonviolence, and nothing should be irreversible in terms of decisions made. But then he'd also say, like, the danger of binary thinking, like the idea, like, let 100 flowers. So much of conflict at the root is, and this is just basic social psychology, is that when we, like, there is an innate human need to categorize, to make sense of the world. But when we categorize and we don't leave room for a continuum or a broad spectrum, that's when we run into trouble. And one of my old bosses, Dr. Mogadam, he does a lot on literature and poetry. So, and my dissertation was in arts. But anyway, so start bringing questions. Please keep letting us know where you're watching from. So from one of your former students, Tatar, great to see you. How do you see the evolving and shifting nature of the conflict landscape, the increase in violent conflict, and organizations that respond to it, decline of actually multilateral response, impacting the what and how people work in this field? Just a small question, but it's a good one.
Well, first of all, great to see you, Ted, and thank you for joining, and thank you for the amazing work you're doing and will continue to do on the issues that matter most to you and to your communities. My take on this, I'll sort of speak personally, which links obviously to who we are professionally. My heart is just endlessly broken, and I think it's hard to sort of say what we do still matters in the face of this increase in violent conflict that Ted is referring to, the diminishment of multilateral relevance, the encroachment of the far right around the world, and the enabling of violence and genocidal violence. I mean, not just sporadic and unfortunate, but deep, deep, existentially horrific violence. And yet here we're calling ourselves peace builders. So I will admit that in the face of that, I can feel that what we're doing is irrelevant or worse somehow. And at the same time, it galvanizes me and activates me and catalyzes me when I see this incredible expansion of organizations around the globe, many of them completely outside of the realm of the elite, outside of the realm of, let's say, the United Nations and its remit. Many of them completely embedded and deeply, deeply rooted in local realities. And they're not localizing, they just are local. That is just their identity, their experience. And I think that the proliferation of these groups, whether they're formal or informal, to me puts us on notice that societies are very much keen to build peace. And they're going to do it whether a guy in New York or a guy in DC or a guy in Medellin is there or not. And so my take is, let's find ways to create synergy and deep relationships and authentic partnerships with those counterparts. And that's really, I think, where I find hope. It's not in another resolution, another UN resolution. It's not in another promised 25% from USAID that has now at something like 5 or 6% funding for local peace building and development efforts. It's really in understanding how radical these groups that are building peace right now in Palestine, in Israel, in Sudan, in South Sudan, in Myanmar, in East Timor, in Northern Ireland, and here in the United States, how transgressive and bold that work is. So I think that I'm optimistic, oddly, that we, as a kind of broad field of peace building, are relevant. Then it's about the how. And I think that gets into more questions of strategy and strategic partnerships and shifting the power, as was recently deeply discussed in Colombia, from inclusion meaning we with elite levels of hegemony and power inviting those who are local to the table, to we really need to think differently around how do we get out of their way or signal boost their efforts, because that's where the action is for me.
Thanks so much. And Ted, feel free to share a bit more about your work. So Ajmal, watching from Hamilton, Canada, he's from Afghanistan. And I will say Ajmal runs a fantastic group. I think it's called Afghans for Progressive Thinking. So I did a workshop for them, and we encourage people to check out their work, because Ajmal, feel free to put more, but they're basically providing amazing online educational opportunities to Afghan, particularly women and girls, but also in Afghanistan, but also outside. And so they do these incredible leadership training programs, and for Afghan diaspora. So please check out their work. Like, it was, I think the group I worked with just for 2 hours, just 25 women from all over Afghanistan, just mind blowing. Like, so please check it out. So his question is, I'm deeply interested in peace building and conflict resolution. I'm eager to understand which strategies you find most effective in complex environments in Afghanistan. Could you share your insights and approaches that have worked in similar regions, and anything you might have to share related to the current context for Afghanistan?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Ajmal, for the work that you're doing and for continuing this journey into this field. And I would love to hear more about your work as well. I think I'd say two things. One is that in general, I reach for two answers to this question, and I kind of repeat myself, and any students of mine who like that will know that I kind of come back to the same themes. One is I've mentioned already, which is relationships. And so to the extent that we can enter spaces of complex conflict directly in partnership through invitation, with invitation from those who are in that environment, I think well, I know that significantly increases our value. In other words, I don't show up unless there's an invitation. That's just how I believe this works. Those who are in that environment know at some level what's needed in terms of resources or expertise or support. And the last thing I want to do is show up uninvited to this party. So the first thing I would say is look for counterparts and look for need and look for opportunities, but through invitation, not through showing up at the party uninvited. So partnerships and relationships that are authentic and sustained is first and foremost from my perspective. On the question of a complex environment where you might have a hegemonic state or non-state actor who may very much limit our counterparts' ability to do anything that's outwardly looking like building peace, because peace is a political act, obviously, as is conflict, one would look at ways in which things that don't look explicitly like building peace are entry points for building peace. So sometimes that's something very far afield that provides the ability to speak to people's lived realities, to address basic human needs or developmental needs, but also bring in things related to social cohesion or things related to human security or things related to addressing gender and power questions of gender and power and patriarchy and masculinities that fuel violence. So what I'm saying is looking for entry points is not looking for party A and party B and let's negotiate an outcome. I think that's a very, very, very limited understanding of what peace building is all about. Working with farmers on increasing yield, if what matters in a conflict landscape is agricultural dynamics that can, when drought hits, can really exacerbate conflict. So maybe the entry point is working with farmers collectives and having that be a conversation and a dialogue about farming, about agriculture, and about your neighbors, and about histories of coexistence, and about historical memory. And I think there are so many ways we can use things that are really mundane: schools, water, agriculture, sports, not in a way that's sort of nice, but that is profoundly political, because we are saying these things are a part of these other things. You know, the lived experience, the everyday experience links to the political landscape of a place. And I think it provides us and our counterparts so many opportunities to help think about conflict differently, talk about conflict differently, do conflict differently. So that's not a strategic do these things to your question, because it's going to look different in each place. And this is something that, for example, that John Paul Lederach has really helped us over the last 30 years understand, that what works in Sudan may or may not work in Afghanistan. So be careful. And one of the things I start every year with when I'm teaching is this idea that Lederach puts forward. I'm sure he didn't invent the phrase, but really captures something true about peace building, which is don't just do something, stand there. And it's this beautiful sense of action without grounding and action without self-reflection and a critical lens can actually be quite problematic, risky, maybe deadly. So the idea of linking action, that's the do something, with reflection and observation and deep engagement with a place, I think is the hallmark of great peace building. We need to do both. And if you're just observing and you're just watching, eventually someone's going to say, hey, get out of my way. I got to go get to work and do something here. But it's that balance and it's this orientation, this humility, and this sense that what you're looking for are opportunities to support fundamentally social love and deep empathy in a place. It's not about a project or an activity. And I think more and more, the field is understanding that the projectizing of peace really is problematic. Now, that's hard to say because that's how I pay my bills is the projectizing of peace. But we're a part of a complex economic and political landscape, and we have to start rethinking this because the stakes are very, very high. So the ultimate aspiration is not another project or another activity. It's really supporting the emergence of, I would say, love and pluralism and dynamism and diversities. And that's the aspiration. And how that gets manifest is going to be very different in Afghanistan versus anywhere else on earth. And that's something beautiful about that at some level, but it also makes the job harder. So I'm sorry I don't have any quick answer, but that's what I think.
Maybe you can do a funding proposal for the 3-step plan to implement peace in X country.
Yes.
Ajmal, please let others know about your work, and please check out. Just a comment from Thet, agreed, our work feels much more salient than ever. As we in Myanmar say, the revolution runs on hope. So I'll say my friend Flynn Coleman has a phrase, and if you haven't read her book, Human Algorithm, she's amazing.
Yes.
You can find her on her podcast. But we had a similar discussion. She said resistance is her hope. Yeah. Like there's a choice. Basically, the world has so many crises and challenges, whether it's peace, inequality, poverty, water, and access. And of course, we need a lot of structural change, and everyone has to make their own choices. But like, is it better to try to do something and not be delusionally optimistic, but at least do it, versus just like retreat and watch Netflix all day, which I do. Some days I just want to watch Netflix.
Good for you.
I'm gonna ask 2 questions, and we'll see which other ones have come in. So first, can you talk about your work at Consensus, like a little bit on the business side? Like, what do you what do you actually do? And then how do you generate the business? And then when you hire partners or consultants or someone for an opportunity, whether it's like short-term or long-term, are you getting like hundreds of applications, or you just look through a network? And what makes the difference, whether it's junior, mid-level, or senior, like that when someone is potentially a fit, and you have like 100 someone's, what makes someone's application or at least skills shine out a little bit more?
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you for asking that. And the beautiful thing about Consensus, which is a consulting firm that I'm a part of, along with my colleague Michael Rosenthal and others, is this really interesting space. I think quite unique, although not exclusive. Others work in the same mode, in which we do have this heavily invested commitment to peace building in an eclectic way, often working with the United Nations and other players, NGOs, INGOs, civil society organizations around the world. And we work heavily in the private sector. And what we do in the private sector is not building peace. Let's be clear. It's not that we're addressing sort of ongoing endemic violence in an oil company. Although I suppose that could be something we work on, but it's really about nurturing ultimately collaborative relationships, whether collaborative leadership, sustainable collaborative negotiation, great communication skills, mentoring skills, coaching skills. You can hear in that all of that anchors into the thread, or has this thread of relationships. And that's the kind of through point for us, that what we do is provide often training, sometimes coaching, consulting, other forms of support to private sector companies, as well as sometimes international organizations and others that have big professional staff, around how do we nurture more collaboration. Actually, in fact, this morning did 2 workshops online for a major UN agency that does essentially almost all of the procurement and other kind of big, large-scale projects on behalf of states that are approaching the United Nations for different forms of infrastructure and activities that are about kind of building and creating and services and products. And in that environment, we're teaching, how do you collaborate? How do you take what could be a conflictual negotiation, whether it's about procurement or management or working with clients or working with vendors, and how do you unlock some of the more collaborative value and collaborative opportunities? And we're teaching strategies and techniques and behaviors and mindsets. And it's really interesting as well, because it brings us out beyond the world of international affairs into all kinds of industries that have an appetite for learning and have an appetite for collaboration and value. And so that's the work of working, that we're up to in the private sector at Consensus. And it builds on all of our strengths, our backgrounds, my own background as a mediator, as a negotiator, as a trainer, as an adult sort of educator, design and delivery and coaching, all these kinds of things that one could use to share all kinds of information. But what we share is information about collaboration and sustainable relationships. Now, on the question of what makes for a great new entrant into the field, if we were looking at a stack of resumes or CVs, if we were hiring for a new position, for the work that we do you like standing up in front of large groups of people who you don't know and who may be quite skeptical of what you're saying, and saying something that speaks to their heart, that challenges their assumptions, that helps them learn and stretches them, and at the same time open yourself to their critiques like, yeah, that'll never work, or you don't understand, or what about this problem that no one could ever solve? Aha, I got you. So it's the ability to be resilient to people's concerns and challenges and everything that goes on in one's head in those environments. So good training is a skill, I think. And it's also about an expertise. So I don't teach all things under the sun. I'm not a generalist. I teach what I teach because I believe in it and because I think I know what I'm talking about most of the time. And so I think expertise in a subfield in a specific niche is helpful for the work that we do. Expertise in sharing that information, whether as a coach or a trainer or a consultant, and the willingness to connect to people and take seriously their challenges. People often say, oh, you work in Iraq, our problems can't be real to you. And I said, that's absolutely untrue. It is true that no one is under threat here, but you're struggling day after day to meet your client's needs or your boss's needs or your own needs. And those are pressing. Is it life or death? No, thank God. But we have to take seriously that people struggle, and our role is to also respond to that reality and dignify it, and still empathy, engagement, openness, curiosity, flexibility. As in the world of peace building internationally, I believe that these are our core strengths as trainers, consultants, and coaches, and accompanying people on journeys, and also knowing that sometimes someone just that's not where they're at, and they may need to resist, they may want to resist, they may be right in a certain form of resistance to a new idea, and that's okay. I think that when we lose our capacity to teach and train and consult is when we need to be right. I think and that's probably true also on the international scale, when our expertise needs to be recognized. And of course, I'm a person that carries around my own ego, and so often this can happen to me. I'm not saying I'm above it, but I'm saying that the capacity to sort of accept that people are where they are, and our job is to bring something and allow them to say how or if this speaks to their needs. And if it doesn't, that's okay. That's okay. So I hope that I'm answering that question around onboarding.
And then how would you break down, and this goes to, if you've been teaching students for almost 2.5 decades, how much of your job is, let's say, client engagement, how much is business development, how much is designing trainings, how much is evaluation? And I mean, I'm just curious, not to have a simple breakdown. And when you're working, Columbia is a terrific university, when you're working with students in applied peace building, and obviously you're helping them get more engagement in the field, do you generally say, I mean, obviously each person depends on their context and career goals, but you generally say, please make sure you don't leave the university without these 3 skills. Or the ones you see often, because I've done a lot of research. As I say, lots of people come into programs and they're filled with theory and they don't have the skills to do the business of change. So so both on your personal thing and your wisdom for students, what do you hope, whether it's your class or others, that anyone considering graduate school, they come out at least with these skills?
That's a great question. I have to say, Craig, I may not have ever told you this before, but I'm going to tell you now. Your report on the kind of gap, early days, I mean, probably 20 years ago, I can't remember when you wrote it, for USIP, maybe, on the sort of the landscape of graduate school education in our field absolutely fundamentally shaped how I thought about applied peace building and teaching it in the graduate environment. In fact, what you found is exactly what you've just shared, which is so many students in our field leave an academic experience, but they don't have a sense of the visceral, tactile strategies that one needs the moment that we graduate from a program. And so your work and the research that you did very much informs how I think about that question of what do we need to build for and offer to graduate students so that they leave more ready. I don't think they can be fully ready. I think that there is this moment of serendipity and just risk taking and leap taking. But in terms of being responsible in building our programs, I think that what we need is for people, what I want for my students is an understanding of what this field is as it expands and contracts, a sense of what it means to be a self-reflective practitioner, reflecting both on our own individual relationship to this field, our own biases and cognitive biases, and then the broader field's dilemmas that often get unexamined. And so critiques of this field, I absolutely want to put in the classroom and allow people to wrestle with. Otherwise, we will continue to replicate the same problems that we've been seeing for the last 25 or 30 years. In addition, people need some skills. You need to be able to communicate effectively. You need to be able to listen. You need to be able to have a challenging conversation with a counterpart who sees things differently. This is it's true everywhere, but when we're in environments of conflict, you just won't survive if you can't navigate challenging conversations. You need cultural awareness. And I don't mean, well, when I'm in Norway, I do these things, and when I'm in Japan, I do those things. I mean, that is, I suppose, one aspect, but really thinking more in a more global way about how culture shows up in subtle, nuanced ways around norms and values, and not so much the behaviors, but what drives the behavior. So cultural competency, cultural kind of acuity, flexibility, adaptability. So those are some skills that we need. We also need to be able to build programs and projects, notwithstanding all of my critiques of projects and programs. That is the currency of the field, for better or for worse. I think you need to be able to do a little bit of research and make sense of data. I think you need to be able to have a good interview and listen to someone speak about something deeply true and sometimes quite painful. I think you need to be able to take care of yourself and stay sane in environments that can be quite insane, and be resilient in a healthy way, and adaptable and adaptive in healthy ways. So self-care and adaptability are other skills that I would strongly call for. So those are some of the things that are front of mind for me. Working with groups, dialogue facilitation, those are other nice to haves. And again, this comes into sort of where do you want to be in the field? If you want to go work at the International Peace Institute or the US Institute of Peace or Berghoff in Europe, or other more sort of thinking and publishing, and Interpeace, for example, these really beautiful organizations, they're really about big ideas and policy and advocacy. I'm not so sure that you need to be able to mediate between two groups. Maybe you do. But I guess what I'm saying is the skills themselves are contingent on what you're doing. And there's not, I think, a universal, everyone needs to have these skills. We need to understand international law. I would say if we're working in international conflict, we need to understand human rights. We need to understand gender as a system of power. We need to understand race and colonialism and what it means to decolonize our systems and our structures. Aside from that, nothing else.
That's a mouthful. Ajmal did share more about his work, so please, he put his email. So again, anybody who's looking to help an amazing organization doing critical work, and maybe Zach, I'm waiting for your book.
Yes, it's coming. All my notes are on the wall. You can't see it, Craig, but they're on the wall. The book is coming.
No, the projectification of social change, and then I have an article. I'm not going to publish it, called "The Training Mafia," because there is a default. I mean, I've done a lot of trainings that are meaningful, and I've been in a lot. But I think it's not just in peace building. The default answer is we have a problem. Let's do a training.
Throw a training at it.
And often it's a waste of money. Not that people don't have a good experience, but it's like, and so this is. Let me ask the question going back to your students. So for people thinking about graduate school, and then maybe we'll do 2 or 3 more questions. What is your advice? Because it's, at least in the US, it can be very expensive. There are places like the Rotary Peace Fellowship or Kroc Notre Dame has full funding, or there are places that offer generous funding. Full transparency, Rotary is a advertiser at PCM, but check out their fellowship. But for people thinking about whether it's time or money or both, how do you pick a grad program, and whether it's an international relations, social work, sociology, and is it worth it? Or is it better just to go out and like find your, whether it's in your home country, region, or somewhere else, it's just better to get the experience? Like, I mean, obviously it's conditional for each person, but what is your advice for people who are thinking about to grad or not?
So here I might make a distinction between the 2 sides of the field that you and I have been kind of linking at some level. If you want to enter the space of international conflict and peace building in an institutional way, you want to be, whether it's in a civil society organization, an international NGO, an NG tank, those that we've been mentioning, my opinion is you need a master's degree. I'm not saying that's necessarily a good thing. It just is the truth. And if I bring out again my former student and now colleague, that she brought exactly what I think is the right mix of lived experience, professional experience, deep within a society that's wrestling with conflict, and then a rock star master's degree. It's hard to get sort of better than that. That equation, as well as a real openness to where the field is going and where you're fit in it, would really be ideal. Now, obviously, we can't all kind of get that equation in place. And as you said, the investment is significant and the barriers are high, particularly for those who are themselves coming from what's often referred to as the global South. And here I think it's really important to call out and call attention to the problem of privilege in our field, because it's a real problem that almost all of the models, the institutions, the frameworks, the funding starts here and goes there, wherever there is. It's not a problem that has no roots. It's a problem of political economy and hegemony and neocolonial legacies that are embedded in our institutions, our universities. The work that we do is filled with that. So what we do about that, this is an aside, but I think I really want to say what we do about that is we seek to break some of that and challenge it and wrestle with it and radicalize how we teach and who we welcome into this space, because it's not ours to own. And it is all connected. These systems of power, these systems of political influence, the economic side of it, the barriers to entry to universities like mine, and then the ability for societies who are wrestling with conflict to progress through those conflicts without encumbrance and with support instead of barriers and resource drains is quite serious. And so I would just encourage us to think along the lines of what can we do, particularly those of us who have leverage, to radicalize and interrogate what we do and how we do it. So master's degree is, I would say, a basic fundamental entry point for our field in the international side. As well, I would encourage people to get good hard skills like qualitative data analysis, quantitative data analysis, be an incredible writer to the extent that you can be, have other niche skills around, for example, I know you're working more and more around issues around AI and things that I don't fully understand and I'm going to learn from you about. These are the themes that really are mattering. Right now, climate crisis and conflict is absolutely front of mind for almost all institutions, and rightly so. So having those expertise that go beyond a kind of generic international affairs, international relations, political science sort of grounding, maybe it's around international law or humanitarian law. So having a bit more expertise around that. On the domestic side, I don't want to speak out of turn because I haven't been deeply in part of that field for long enough that I don't want to say definitively one way or the other. My instinct is one can do very, very well doing great work in kind of domestic North American dispute resolution, conflict resolution, mediation, also in Europe and elsewhere, potentially without a graduate degree. If what you bring is great skills and great energy and innovation, I think there is a distinction to be made there.
Okay, so I'll bring in one more question, then 2 more will wrap up. So Maria Pia asked about career planning. If her early background's in INGO and UN agency, she has a master's in policy, but not that much in conflict. Do you think skills like that would be valuable at Consensus? And kind of a related question for people who are thinking about, whether it's Maria P or others, like who are not your competitors, but who are your natural allies, so ADR advantage. Like when people think about, there's like Dahlberg, which is more like, so if you want to think like, who are the either big or smaller institutions, whether in the US or elsewhere, that you, not necessarily competitors, but just doing interesting work if people are looking for a career where they're maybe not embedded just like in Mercy Corps, IRC or UNDP, but kind of doing systematic like work with clients around both systematic and short-term issues around organizational challenges or conflict.
Trying to see if I captured the questions as you shared them. On the question of, and I certainly would not call them competitors. I think that's a great reframe. We work closely, we meaning Consensus, with those who work in our space and could do work that we're doing, and we can do work that they're doing, and we work in a profoundly collaborative way. Often they're sort of smaller shops, and that makes us all more nimble and more able to handshake with a counterpart and say, hey, this project, we were talking earlier, Craig, about our shared friend and colleague, Josh Weiss, who is another practitioner, comes out of the world of the Harvard program on negotiation, is now and has been in the university space for quite some time, and also is a practitioner like we are. So Josh and I are working together. He's coming on board with Consensus. I hope to work with him on things that his team is working on. He's doing such innovative work over the last many decades, along with his colleague and friend, Bill Urey. And so there are shops that are small and nimble, and then there's sort of the next scale up, which would be things like CBI, the Consensus Building Institute. Our friend and colleague, David Fairman over there, been doing really innovative work for decades, well before I got into this field. And then others that you mentioned that are kind of the next scale up. So Dahlberg, as a consulting firm, gets involved in this work. We've been partnering at Consensus with a really wonderful organization called Fitch Consulting that does not necessarily things related to conflict, but around development, around adult learning in the UN system and whatnot. And then you can go to the next scale up. So the Deloittes and the McKinseys of the world very much play in this space as consultants to the United Nations, USAID, big government organizations. Now, I want to say something about this, which is every one of the organizations I raised, that I mentioned, and we could go even further. We could speak about Mercy Corps, I think you mentioned, Save the Children, Oxfam, these multi-mandated organizations that do development, humanitarian assistance, human rights, and conflict, do great work and are open to critiques. We also need to be able to say, what does it mean to work with an organization that has as a client some actors that some might have concerns about? I'm not calling out any of those organizations. I'm just saying that as you're thinking about entering this field, be ready to confront some really deep existential dilemmas about your own political self, your own moral self, your own values. And the fundamental question that you'll be asking yourself over and over is it better to work in this way and have this opportunity to add value and do interesting work and maybe make change, but with a partner that may be not my favorite, doesn't necessarily pass every single litmus test that one could put forward, or, and this is legit, I don't want to play in that space. I want to find my own way through, for example, working directly with Belen, an incredible national NGO in East Timor and Timor-Leste that has deep, deep roots in Timor from its earliest days of being a country that does work that is purely Timorese and that is led by Timorese and that is a Timorese ethos and way of thinking. That's a different route that you can go. It gives different value, different rewards, different challenges. It needs different skills. You got to brush on your Tetum, the language of East Timor, for example. But that's another totally legitimate route. You don't need to be in DC or Paris or New York or even Nairobi to do this work. You could be in Dili, you could be in Beirut, you could be in Khartoum. And the choices that you make are very much personal. And I don't think that any of these routes is right or wrong. And it's really about navigating towards what resonates for you. And then looking for serendipity, a word that we talked about earlier. Those serendipitous conversations, engagements, those moments of all of a sudden there's this opportunity, and what do we do? Do we step into that? So one of the things I tell my students repeatedly is have existential dilemmas. Welcome them into your practice. Welcome them into your life. Be brokenhearted about these choices that you're making and how you're navigating and whether you're doing good or not. But then get up and do something. So have the dilemma and then decide, therefore, what? If you skip one of those steps, you're really not going to add much value to this space. So that's my thinking on it.
That might be your book, The Serendipity of Existential Crises, or something like that. Because I do.
Yes. Well, fair enough.
So last two questions. I'm gonna. I actually have to go open the door in 1 second. So I'm gonna ask you a question. I'll be back in 30 seconds.
Yeah, of course.
So we're gonna finish up in like 3 minutes, but people are listening. So the first question is, where do you go for your community networks, like Alliance for Peacebuilding? And I'll be back in 30 seconds, and we'll start wrapping up.
I'll answer that question. So Craig is making reference to Alliance for Peacebuilding, which I had the real pleasure and joy and honor of earliest kind of incarnations. Incarnations, is that the word? Sounds right. When it began. And I think that those networks, the Alliance for Peacebuilding, you mentioned ACR, the Alliance for the Association for Conflict Resolution, these professional networks are really important spaces for anyone who wants to enter this field. At this point, I think I overdid it on conferencing. So I haven't gone to conferences in a while. And that's not because I think they're good or bad. It just doesn't kind of speak to what I need right now. I really am interested in engaging directly with people who are doing interesting work, like you, like Josh, like my colleagues in East Timor or in Iraq. And I think that, and going to professional events and being a part of these very now quite robust networks is really important. It gives you a sense of the landscape. It gives you a sense of what's happening right now in these spaces, in a way more so than you can learn in a classroom, even with me, because I'm teaching something that kind of exists. It's not necessarily a pulse check on the immediate issues of the day. So for that, you need to get out there. You need to be engaging, and that costs things. That costs money, it costs time, it costs mind space, it costs lots of stuff. So that, you need to start making some choices around that. But I do think finding your people is significant. And I'll once again make a pitch for scholars, authors, thinkers who don't necessarily self-identify as being a part of the world of peace building. For me, for example, and my students will know this, James Baldwin, Bell Hooks, Hannah Arendt, June Jordan. These are thinkers, political philosophers, poets who tell us something about the human condition that we need to understand at a deeper level to do work that I think speaks to that human condition. So go to poetry readings, go to art, go to music, and look at those things for what they are, but also for maybe what they evoke for you about the human condition, about conflict, about loss. Every one of those authors that I mentioned teaches us something so profound about violence, about conflict, about power, about love, about empathy. And that's really what we need in the field, more so than just another really well-designed, logical framework for a project. I guess we need both, but my concern is more of the former, to inform really good activities and projects and whatnot.
Okay, so last two questions. I mean, you're kind of touching on this already.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any recent book, movie, podcast, doesn't have anything to do with work, that just is occupying your brain? Could be totally fiction and creative, but anything you're just saying, this is really interesting, you might encourage others to take a look at?
Yes, two things. One, I'll get it from three things if I can. I'm gonna go get it off my shelf, so excuse me.
And just while we're waiting, so actually, Zach mentioned Will Urey, so co-author of Getting to Yes. So he's actually on the Tim Ferriss podcast that this episode launched yesterday. So
nice.
And if you haven't looked at Bill Urey's book, work, I mean, many things of work, both some things are well known and other things are not shared publicly just for confidentiality.
Yeah.
I mean, he's one of the world's most interesting negotiators. Take a listen.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so I'll share two books, and then I'll talk about a musical experience that I had, and maybe a report. Can I do this? Is okay to show?
100%. Go for it. Yes.
All right. So when Thet, who was in the call, pinged us, I remember that I gave her a copy. She was my teaching assistant last year, and when we finished this semester, I gave her a copy of this, The Book of Delights by Ross Gay. It's little, what he calls essays or essayettes, and they're all about joy. They're all about delights, but not from the perspective of a naive, overly optimistic worldview, but in fact, are very much a heartbroken worldview and experience. He's poetic. He's understands and helps us understand the deep brokenness of the world and delight and joy. And his work really reveals also these tiny connections between everyday joys, human experience, and the political. And that's something that matters so much to me, is looking at things like joy, yes, from an experiential vantage point and a poetic one, but also a political one. And when we're wrapping up, I'll say one last thing about that. Remind me, I want to make that point. Another strong book, this is not necessarily that new, but one that really influenced how I'm thinking about these things, is called Humankind by Rutger Bregman. It's sort of in the realm of a Daniel Pink meets a Malcolm Gladwell and publishes an incredibly thick book. Incredible in the sense that it's an accessible way of saying the following: human society is not inherently violent or conflictual. Now, who cares about that? I mean, well, the way that he explores this helps us understand the implications of building a society based on the understanding that we are all inherently violent at some deeper level. Policies around policing, around access to justice, around urban planning, on and on and on, are all predicated on a misread, he's arguing, of what it really means to be human. And I won't take away his any of the details, but for any of us who've studied social psychology and political science, he really helps us rethink some certainties on which our field is predicated. So yeah, those, I think I'll leave it there, those two things. One last thing I'll say is, last week, I went to music in New York City of an artist who wrote a translation of Rumi called Gold. And if you just search for Rumi and Gold, you will see Hala's work, who really evokes the musicality of Rumi, the passion, the transcendence, but does it also frame with a relationship to the lived world, the experience of a political world. So that was really, really lovely, and to kind of have that visceral sonic and visual experience, and then be able to pick up the book and see what does Rumi say about some of these things. Rumi, who very famously has a lot to say about love and loss. And so, and again, for me, I think about love. I've used that word a couple of times, Craig, a little bit self-conscious when I say it, because it's not a big part of the discourse in our field. And that's why I'm saying it. I think about love as a political phenomenon. It's obviously also an emotional space between people, but inspired by Martin Luther King and James Baldwin, at some level, Hannah Arendt, although she had a complicated relationship with love, certainly bell hooks. I really believe that what happens when conflict changes hinges not on negotiation and strategy, but at a deeper level, a radicalizing of relationships. And that's very hard to do. But those writers and those thinkers help us look into that possibility. And you mentioned my book, which is right now in my head and on that wall. The book itself and kind of what matters to me is what I am calling and have called for many years, the intimacy of enemies. And this idea that when peace building is happening at that local, experiential, interactive level, that face-to-face, that engaged level, when it's happening in certain ways in a sustained and self-driven way, not because a UN agency told groups to get together, but because there is this absolute irresistible need to address conflict, that coming together of enemies across borders creates a political moment, an intimacy, a sense of what could be possible if we engage in these ways. So the intimacy of enemies is this idea that is descriptive. I'm not telling anyone what to do. I'm describing what's happening when groups transgress and cross borders and engage and activate agency to really say no to toxic, polarized identities. And they're doing it in an environment that's, I don't want to say it's not easy is such an understatement. It's almost unbelievable, the environments in which peace building is happening at that deep local level, that intimacy that's happening. And I want us to understand it. Yes, our work in contact theory and other social psychology would tell us when A meets B, changes can happen. And I'm not saying it's not. What I'm saying is it's well beyond that. It's a political power and energy that these groups only have access to, that we don't have access to. And they understand it in a way that we don't. And when I say we, I mean people situated where I am and some level, Craig, where you are, with all kinds of privilege and prestige and resources and comfort. I think it's our job to understand it as it is. And so I'm describing it as an intimacy of enemies. And I see it as the single most important power for shifting deep, violent, intractable social relations.
It's a very powerful title. You might want to. I'm not going to say, but you might want to trademark it since you said it publicly. And just to say, I was fortunate to have Professor Benjamin Broom as a professor many years ago, and really his work on he did many years. He's done a lot of work with Native Americans, but also a lot in Cyprus, and talks a lot about the building of a third culture, which is a little bit like Shari from Superordinate Goals, but it really is this ability, like you're neither A or B, and in this space of interacting, you're creating this transcendent culture, which doesn't abolish their identities. And I would push you to go to one step further, because I love the title, but the question is, how do you go to the intimacy of enemies to build the institutions that don't bureaucratize, because it's not all about relationships, even though it is. And so how do you take this incredibly, let's say, magical thing that happens sometimes?
Right.
Sometimes it's a moment, sometimes it actually goes broader than that. But then how do you put that into policy and institutions that don't let's say, fossilize it.
Yeah.
Because that's like,
Yeah.
you know, but I would encourage you to start. Maybe that's your podcast or book, but it's you heard it here first.
That's the last chapter of the book, Craig. That's it right there. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And you know, just your comment about this kind of third culture brings to mind a notion that the feminist Chicana writer Gloria Anzandulas raised, where she talks about borderlands as being this wound between communities or between societies, particularly in Latin America and North America and our US and Mexico. She talks about the border being a kind of wound, but in that wound, something else emerges. And it's essentially what you're talking about, what I'm talking about, this intimacy, this rethinking of who we are together. And it's hard, and it's fragile, and it's full of problems. So we have to understand it, I think, and we have to, yes, also ask questions about policy and institutions and governance and sustainability and scalability, right? Because what I'm talking about is small, it's tiny. What my advisor, mentor, and really kind of luminary in my world, Jeff Goldfarb, talks about the politics of small things. And what he's really, and by the way, he's echoing Arundhati Roy's notion of the God of small things, and this idea that small things are actually intense and incredible, even though we can't see them, because they're operating at this level of human interaction and human experience. And so we have to take those seriously, but it's hard because we work in a world of, you know, you cannot open a single document in our field that doesn't scream systems change and systems thinking. And I love that work, the work of Rob Rosigliano, for example, who does just incredible work at the level of systems. And yet I am talking about something that does not actually exist in systems. It exists between people. So how do we reconcile that? I don't know. Stay tuned.
Second, but so we went way over time. Last just thing. What is the best channel to follow you on? And then for people who are interested, I mean, obviously they could potentially go to Columbia and take a class with you, but do you do any public trainings, or does Consensus do anything that is not like, if there's someone who's like, this is interesting, and is there any, or where do you recommend
kind of finding each other?
We've talked about a lot of the resources, but also like if someone wanted to get more training, we've talked about Alliance for Peacebuilding, Association for Conflict Resolution, Mediators Beyond Borders, but like does Consensus or you do anything? Actually, you got one more comment, but if you can answer that, then I'll bring in the last comment, then we'll wrap up.
Okay, sure. So yeah, the best way to connect really would be probably through LinkedIn. I am notoriously bad at anything related to social media. I have to admit that, and no one would say anything to disagree with that. But if you reach out to me on LinkedIn, I will absolutely respond and connect. And if there's something that I can do to support you in your journey in this field, I will certainly do it. So I think that's the best way to connect. And in terms of sort of public stuff and other ways of getting involved, for example, in the work of Consensus, again, I would explore that kind of individually with folks in maybe through a conversation on LinkedIn and whatnot. But you know, this conversation has fired me up, so maybe new things can emerge, and we can look at sort of good opportunities.
Okay, and then the last comment, just bringing in from Julia, another former student, just saying thank you so much for the names, the emphasis on love, and the idea of intimacy of enemies. So thank you so much, Zach. We went way over time, but it was fine with me, for sharing your wisdom, and especially after training all morning. Thank you for everyone for participating wherever you were. Again, just as we started off with, 3 quick asks: follow Zach on LinkedIn, check out Consensus, check out PCDN, and please consider rating or sharing the podcast. You can go to PCDN Global and check out 100 and I think almost 50 other episodes. Amazing. Season 12 is amazing. Thank you for all you are doing for impact in the world. And hopefully, I mean, I'll talk to you before this, but hopefully if we do a repeat episode, then the book is out, or the podcast, or maybe we have a musical album, or it could just be a book of poetry. But thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Craig. Okay. Thanks to everybody for joining us.